Hi everyone, Suzanne here. I hope you're all well and welcome to Sew Custom. Today's video is how I sewed up this little number. So if you're interested in seeing that, then let's get started.
Starting with the fabric, for the outer I'm using this gorgeous tweed. It's on this beautiful blue background and has some pinks, some greens, really lovely fabric. And then for lining I'm using this viscose in a contrast pink. And on to the cutting out. This is my back. I have 2 layers of that tweed fabric underneath my pattern piece and a couple of notches here which I'm going to mark slightly differently to my usual method. So because this fabric is tweed and it has quite a loose weave, if I notch it with my scissors, the weave will very easily come apart. So what I'm going to do here is notch with some thread tacks. So I've just pinned at my notch and then taken a contrasting thread and then created a little tack just where the pin pierces the fabric. So that's the first tack created. And for the second, doing exactly the same thing. So popping my needle in where the pin pierces the fabric, creating a loop top and bottom, snipping the excess thread, and then separating the 2 pieces and snipping in the center. So that's my back all cut out and my thread tacks in place. Now on to the front. My fabric underneath is on the fold and I have 2 tacks to create here. So I have a really important little mark that will tell me later on where I need to join my side panels, and then a second at the center on the waist. So that's my front all cut out, my thread tacks in place, and now that that's done I can join my front and back together at the side seam. So laying my back over my front, my fabric is right sides together, lining up my edges and ready to stitch. Starting with a back stitch, sewing at my 1 centimeter seam allowance and finishing with a back stitch. So I finished my edges, pressed out my seam, and now that that's done, I can move on to my side panels. This is my front. I have 2 layers of fabric underneath my pattern piece. So that's ready to be joined to my back at the side seam. And same thing again here for the back. 2 layers of fabric, and as I say, joining these at that side seam. My fabric is right sides together, and stitching here at my 1 centimeter seam allowance. I finished my edges and pressed out my seam, and before I can add this to my skirt, I want to add some trim. So I'm just using a tiny little piece here just so that you guys can see the method. So I've cut myself a strip of fabric on the bias. It's about 1 inch wide, and the first thing to do is to run a couple of lines of stitches right along the center. So I'm using a tiny little stitch length. So that's the first line done. So the first line of stitches will hold all of those threads together, and any that have been missed on the first line will be caught hopefully by this second line. So now that that's done, I can start to fray the edges. So I'm using an old seam ripper here, and I'm just placing it right in the weave, and what I'm attempting to do here is to unravel all of those threads along one side. So this takes a little bit of time to do, and once it's done you'll end up with something that looks a little bit like this, which needs a bit of a tidy up. So I'm just lining my ruler up with that center line and trimming any excess thread. So that looks a bit nicer now, and I've done exactly the same thing to create the trim for my skirt, and this is how that looks. And I've done that twice. So back to my side panels, lining up the unfrayed edge of my trim with the edge of my panels, and ready to stitch. Sewing this time within my seam allowance, just wanting to tack this into place for now. Little pivot at my corners, so that's my trim all tacked into place. It's had a press, and now that that's done, I'm ready to add this entire piece to my skirt. So I'm going to add this in 2 stages. So the first is along that bottom edge. So you'll remember the tacks that I placed earlier. I'm just lining the edge of my side panels with those tacks on both sides, lining up my side seam in the center and ready to stitch. And I'm being really careful here to place my needle right on that thread tack, back stitching and then sewing at my 1 centimeter seam allowance the whole way across, finishing with a back stitch at that second thread tack. So that's that bottom edge in place, and before I can sew up the side edges, I need to snip my corners. So again, being really careful here, snipping right up to that thread tack, and that will just release the fabric and allow me to get a nice accurate corner and more easily sew up those sides. So laying my back over that side panel, lining up my edges and ready to stitch. Sewing at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, starting with a back stitch right on that tack at the bottom and finishing with a back stitch at the waist. And I've repeated that process for the other side. I finished my edges and pressed, and this is what I get. Super happy with this. And while I was at the overlocker, I've also ran that centre back seam and my hem through it, and now that that's done, I'm ready for the waistband. My fabric underneath is on the fold. I have 2 thread tacks to place here, one at the side seam and one at the centre on the fold line, and I'm cutting this out twice. And off camera I've ran a little bit of interfacing along one of those pieces. I'll attach that to my lining in a little bit, but for now I want to attach the one without interfacing to my outer. My fabric is right sides together, lining up my tacks and ready to stitch. Sewing at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, starting and finishing with a back stitch. So I've pressed that seam up into the waistband, and that's how that looks. So now to close up that centre back seam. And in preparation for adding my zip, I've popped in a little bit of that same interfacing on both sides. So laying one side over the other my fabric is right sides together, and I'm going to stitch here from the hem to my thread tack using a regular stitch length, and then from my thread tack to the waist using the longest stitch length on my machine. Backstitching at that tack, adjusting my stitch length and continuing up to the waist. I've pressed my seam open, and now that that's done, I'm ready to add my zip. I'm using a standard conceal zip here, and I'm just lining up the zipper teeth right in the centre of that seam, and I'm going to hand tack the zipper tape to the seam allowance in underneath. I'll finish that off camera. So now that my zip is hand tacked into place, I can remove those machine tacking stitches. So that allows me to open up my zip and more easily and more accurately stitch into place. So using my standard conceal zipper foot here, I'm placing my needle as close to the zipper tape as I can get and stitching from the bottom the whole way up. I'll do exactly the same to the other side, and this is what I get. Happy with that. So now to take care of the hem. So I wanted to have a go at a bias finished hem, so I've cut myself a strip of the lining fabric on the bias. It's about 1 inch wide, and I'm just lining it up right sides together with that centre back seam and stitching here at about half of my hem allowance, using a little bit of a longer stitch length, trying to keep that bias lined up with the edge of the hem the whole way around. And then when I get back to my starting position, just folding the bias back on itself and stitching right over the top. So I've trimmed off that excess tape, and here just pressing the bias away from the skirt in preparation for understitching. So I'm going to run a line of stitches through the bias, through the hem underneath, and I'm about 1 millimetre or so away from the seam you've just seen me sew. And what this understitching will do is help that bias to sit nicely tucked away in underneath and not poke out too much. So now to finish the hem, I just need to take care of that raw edge. So I'm folding it in underneath and pressing, folding again and pressing. I'll finish that off camera. So now all I have to do is stitch this down, and I've decided to hand stitch. So I'm anchoring my thread at that centre back seam and then just picking up a little bit of the bias along that crease edge, a little bit of the skirt fabric underneath, a little bit of the bias along the crease, and a little bit of the skirt fabric. And I'll repeat that the whole way around. And this is the result. I've given it a good press, Very happy with this. So now I want to add a bit of embellishment just along those side panels. So I've decided on some ornate buttons, and to amp them up a little bit further, I want to add some of the threads from the outer fabric into those little grooves. So I'm just picking up 2 of those background threads using the blue colour here and pulling them out of the fabric, and this is what I'm aiming for. So I've just popped my threads onto a needle, and I'm just going to weave in and out of those grooves the whole way around, leaving myself a little tail to start. And then tying off my threads to finish, and I'll repeat that 5 more times. So now to add these to the skirt. So I'm just placing them about 1 inch or so down from the waistband, and then about 3 inches or so apart in between those side and front panels. And once they're all sewed on, this is how they look, and I'm over the moon with these. Super happy with how they turned out. So that completes the outer of my skirt. Now for the lining. So off camera, I've just cut all of the same pieces out, sewn them together in exactly the same way as I did the outer. I finished all of my edges, added my waistband, and now I'm ready to close up that centre back seam. And this time I'm going to sew from the hem up to my zip notch using a regular stitch length, starting and finishing with a back stitch. I've pressed my seam open the whole way up, and while I was at the pressing table, I've also pressed my hem in underneath by its allowance. And this time I'm going to stitch at the machine using that little bit of a longer stitch length again, sewing right through those overlock stitches, starting with a back stitch and finishing with a back stitch. That's had a good press. So now that my centre back seam is sewn up and my hem is taken care of, I can join this to my outer, first of all at the waist. So I'm just popping my outer skirt in through my lining so that both fabrics are right sides together. I'm lining up those thread tacks along the waist, opening up my zip and lining up those edges also, and ready to stitch. Starting at the bottom of the waistband on one side, back stitching, making sure I'm not sewing into my zipper teeth here, little pivot at the top, and stitching the whole way across at my 1 centimeter seam allowance. And then I was supposed to finish at the bottom of the waist on this side, but I got a little bit carried away and just continued the whole way down the zip. So off camera I stitched the other side of the zip down, and now I'm ready to understitch. So I've pulled my lining to one side, my seam allowance is pressed towards the lining, and I'm stitching about 1 millimeter or 2 away from the seam you've just seen me sew. Just in exactly the same way as I did on the bias earlier. And this would have been much easier to sew if I had have just stitched around the waistband and not down the zip. But it's perfectly doable, just a little bit more awkward. So that's my lining attached to my outer. My waist is all understitched, and at the back my zip is nicely enclosed with the lining fabric. And from the inside, nice and neat and tidy. Super happy with this. So I just have one final thing to do to complete this skirt, and that is to join the inner waistband with the outer right along that seam. So I'm going to stitch in the ditch. So I'm placing my needle right in the center of that seam and trying to stick to that ditch the whole way across. This is just going to stop anything shifting around inside the skirt. And hopefully this stitch line, if I'm doing it correctly, will remain invisible from the top, and I will have picked up the waistband from in underneath at the same time. So that's my top and bottom waistband joined together. I just need to give the whole thing one final press. And with that, this little skirt is complete. So I've got that gorgeous bit of fraying sandwiched in between my side, front and back panels. I've got those lovely embellished buttons with that thread going through the grooves around the outside, that beautiful bit of flare around the hem, and that bias bound finish. My zip all nicely enclosed at the back, and that really vibrant bit of pink with the lining underneath. And this is how it looks on. So I absolutely love the shape of this. The fit is super nice, it's so comfortable. I love the length, I love that bit of flare at the hem. All of those embellishments with the trim and the buttons, that little bit of bias that just pops through at the hem. You could go even further with the embellishments. Those of you that have been here for a while will have seen my Chanel style jacket where I added some beads into the trim. I'll leave that video linked below, but I'm so over the moon with this one.
So I really hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope you find it useful. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you've not yet subscribed, please do, and I shall see you on Friday. Until then, I hope you have a fantastic week. Bye, folks!